questions, and thank you to folks who are joining us online and in person. This is our first event of the year where we're discovering what it's like to have the Heller Graduate School on a new block schedule with undergraduates, as well as our building shared with graduate and undergraduate courses. My name is Maria Madison. I'm the interim dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. And we are excited to be able to have today's conversation and to be in community with folks on the line as well as in the room, particularly to focus on the topic of AI ethics and mitigating harm and creating value. Our fearless leader in this work is Dr. Ezra Tefera, who leads our racial justice tech policy program within the Institute for Economic and Racial Equity. The Institute was founded through a generous donation from the Kapoor family in their Kapoor Foundation. And the idea is to bring as many people as possible into conversation and into community to understand the relationship of artificial intelligence on our lives, our careers, and our life course. So to get us started, I wanted to just share with you a few of the ideas that are central to higher ed and its role within artificial intelligence. In particular, we had a trainer to some of our leaders in the community a few months back. Her name is Professor Cheetam Talgar. And she described, of course, that the issues of AI impact everything we do, everything from business and financial operations to farming, fishing, forestry, every aspect of our lives, but not the least of which is within this community, educational environment. And within an educational environment in particular, we're always reminded that we're in a rapidly changing learning environment, and that impacts every single one of us and how we interact with each other. It also impacts how we interact with AI and human-robot interactions, as well as an increased speed of an abundance of information, which you're all experiencing either as teachers or faculty in the classroom. It's innovative, and it impacts how students decide where they want to go to school and how or whether they're going to be accepted into that environment. So everything from the virtuous circle of admissions on enrollment into the academic environment, which you can see in the applications to college chart, through to the learning journey, which includes personalized learning, making much better use of technology to adapt the curriculum to the various levels of ability of every individual in your course, like personalized medicine, personalized academic experience, through to student support, research support, administrative support, all the way through to post-graduation, and looking at the ways in which career services can advance how one approaches the job search process with support of artificial intelligence. We're working on all of these areas, and if you're interested in learning more specifically about any of these aspects, Lynn Davis for admissions would be excited to work or speak with you on the applications of AI in admissions along with her team, as well as post-graduation, our career services director, Jasmine Waddell, who's been training people on how to get an edge on the job search by using AI. However, we already know, many of us, that the garbage in, garbage out is the old adage, that the use of artificial intelligence is only as good as the programmers and those who apply that use. And it is fraught with bias. And so the work of the Racial Justice Tech Policy Program is to raise awareness about the role of every individual to become engaged in understanding the source of that data and actively either controlling how it's used in your own life or how it's used in your experiences with others, whether that's personal or professional. And to be cognizant of all the different ways in which those data can be biased and how that bias can represent an unethical advantage or disadvantage for you or other populations. So you can see here sort of a short version of the hundreds of types of bias that exist, but these are the most common that are associated with artificial intelligence. I'm not going to go through each of these, but we will be hearing about various aspects of these when we hear from our speakers in a couple of minutes. What we want to help everybody think about, particularly through the efforts of dialogue and conversations about the role of AI in education and our lives, is how we can help populations move from resistance to integration. That everybody has a role. It's not for just experts. It's not just for individuals in STEM or programmers. It's impacting all of us. So we're excited to begin a series of conversations, particularly during the 65th year of the Heller School, that helps to bring these topics more into the general population and general conversations. So with that, I'm excited to introduce today's speakers, whom we're really proud of. One of our doctoral students whose work has focused in this area. Ian Moura is a doctoral student in the Children, Youth, and Families concentration at the Heller School, and his research interests include services and outcomes for autistic adults, disability policy, and algorithmic bias. And Ian is also joined by Nir Eisikovits, who's a professor of philosophy and founding director of the Applied Ethics Center. Before coming to UMass Boston, he taught legal and political philosophy at Suffolk University, where he co-founded and directed the graduate program in ethics and public policy. Professor Eisikovits, his research focuses on the ethics of war and the ethics of technology. So before I invite them to present to us, I would like to first thank them for inaugurating this conversation series by sharing with you, each of you, a book from the Kapors on closing the equity gap, where they emphasize the need for every citizen in the population, and particularly those who are marginalized in society, to come into conversation to understand the role of and impact of AI on every aspect of our lives. So with that, please join me in welcoming our two speakers today, beginning with Dr. Moura.
Ezra, do I need to adjust this or? Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for your patience with technical troubleshooting. As Dean Madison said, I'm a doctoral student here at the Heller School, and I focus on, among other things, algorithmic bias. So I'm going to today talk about some of the more structural society impacts of AI, and then I'm going to hand it off to Nir to maybe get into more of the people parts. So I'm going to first talk about what AI is, and then what algorithmic bias is, and where it comes from, and hopefully end on a slightly more positive note with kind of what we can do about it. I wanted to start by defining artificial intelligence, or AI, because it's a term that's getting used a lot, but not always in a consistent way. So it's become one of those terms that is everywhere, but rarely is it actually defined. So one way of defining artificial intelligence is that it's the intelligence of machines or computers rather than living things. And another way of thinking of that is when you hear the phrase artificial intelligence or AI, that's referring to computational systems that are programmed in a way that lets them complete tasks that usually rely on human cognition. But there's a lot of nuance and subtlety in how we decide what is or isn't really AI. And this is sometimes described as Tesla's theorem after Larry Tesler, or the AI effect. So the first quote on this screen is that AI is whatever hasn't been done yet, right? So whatever we haven't quite achieved, that's AI. Pamela McCorduck, who was a social scientist who's studied AI in the 70s and 80s, put it a little more descriptively, and she said that part of the history of the field of artificial intelligence is that every time somebody figured out how to make a computer do something, play good checkers, solve simple but relatively informal problems, there was a chorus of critics to say, that's not thinking. So the point here is that as advanced technology becomes more commonplace, our standards for what's really AI tend to shift. And so we're at this moment now where, for the most part, we're carrying pretty advanced computers in our pockets most of the time. And a lot of the things they do would have been described as AI 10, 20 years ago, but now we just think of them as things that smartphones do. And that's something to keep in mind throughout this discussion is that what AI is not just a technical question, it's also a question of society's response to and perception of and interaction with that technology. One challenge of having these imprecise and inconsistent terms is that it makes it very difficult to regulate AI. It's hard to govern something if people can't agree about what that something is. So in my own work, I tend to mostly use the word algorithm. And an algorithm is a set of instructions which can be followed step by step using specific input to arrive at a particular outcome. Lots of algorithms are computer-based, but they don't have to be. So if you've ever used a recipe and you've taken the input of ingredients and followed a series of steps and arrived at the outcome of a dish, you have used algorithms in your own life. You can kind of think of it as the broadest category is algorithm. It includes lots of things. Some of those things are artificial intelligence, and some artificial intelligence is machine learning. So a lot of the AI we're hearing about in the news these days, large language models like ChatGPT or facial recognition software, uses an approach called machine learning, and that's one subcategory of AI. But there are lots of other ways of making programs that are AI, and sometimes companies and the media and other groups capitalize on our association now, assuming if we hear AI that it's this very advanced new machine learning and not some of the older approaches that are well established. So to kind of wrap up this definition section of my comments, I just wanted to give a few examples of AI to really cement this idea that it's not magic, it's taking input, following steps to reach some outcome. So that might mean text input, like you give a prompt to ChatGPT, it follows some steps, you get text output. You could take medical record data, follow some steps, and have a tool that performs diagnostic identification. You could take images as input, follow steps, and perform facial recognition. You could use credit history to produce lending risk scores, like a lot of financial institutes do. Or you could take someone's personal and criminal background and follow steps to produce recidivism prediction. And these are all real examples of different AI tools that are being used in the world right now. So I want to shift and talk about what algorithmic bias is. Algorithmic bias is decision-making that uses an algorithmic tool, including AI, and is prejudicial towards a particular person or group, especially in ways that are considered unfair. And this might sound like it's a technical problem, but algorithmic bias can involve a lot of different things. So it can be about that technical piece of how an algorithm functions or how AI functions, but it also has to do with the context where these tools are used, with how well they kind of are in accordance with certain rules or regulations, particularly those that we lay out as a society. It can have to do with whether that technology meets certain objectives that we've defined. It can have to do with the consistency of that algorithm's output with previous human decision making. And it can also be about how well that algorithm's approach to fairness matches the situation where we're using it. So clearly, algorithmic bias has a lot to do with fairness. But part of what makes this a complicated problem is that fairness is subjective, it's contextual, and there are a lot of ways to define it. And often you can't satisfy all of those definitions at once. So to give an example, many of you might be familiar with the idea of equality, equity, and justice as kind of three different approaches to trying to achieve fairness. So if you think of equality in terms of everyone receives the same treatment, regardless of any individual differences or group membership, that might mean thinking about fairness in terms of how individual people are treated and making sure they all get the same treatment. But you could also think about fairness in terms of equity. And that might mean that everybody has access to the same resources or everybody achieves a similar outcome, even if that means that you have to treat different people differently to accomplish that. So now you're emphasizing fairness in terms of results for individuals across groups. And then finally, you could also think of fairness in terms of justice. And that might mean shifting to think less about individual treatment or outcomes, and instead thinking about how do we address systemic factors that contribute to those unfair situations in the first place. And when you shift to that way of thinking about fairness, you're emphasizing more questions of resolving underlying issues that might disproportionately impact certain groups and less about just the treatment or the outcome. And I want to stress that none of these are not the only approaches, and none of them is the wrong approach, but they're different approaches, and you can't do them all. So part of algorithmic fairness and bias has to do with which approach you choose and how well it matches the problem you're trying to address. A couple important points to keep in mind. So as I kind of hinted, different organizations and individuals can have really different understandings of fairness, even when they're thinking about the same situation. So it's not even just about what definition of fairness we use, it's also about whose definition of fairness we use. Another thing to keep in mind is that AI is prone to a lot of the same kinds of errors and problems as human decision making. And we tend to talk about AI in ways that give it more agency than it deserves. So AI doesn't make decisions. People make decisions. Sometimes they use AI as part of that decision-making process. But we're not living in a world of autonomous computer programs that run things without our consent. We're choosing to adopt these tools and we're choosing to use them in certain ways. There are also a lot of trade-offs in choosing one definition of fairness over another, and that's not unique to AI. So using AI doesn't guarantee fairness, but saying, okay, then we won't use it, that also doesn't mean that everything is fair. These are issues of society and humanity and collective decision-making, and right now they're popping up because of our adoption of and use of AI, but they existed before this, and they're going to continue to exist regardless of how we address these challenges with this technology. And finally, and maybe most importantly, fairness is linked to the distribution of power within society. So not everyone has the same ability to define and regulate fair outcomes. And when we talk about fairness as an abstract thing, we miss that important piece that a lot of what fairness is has to do with power. So quickly before I kind of move on to what causes algorithmic bias and what we can do about it, I wanted to give a couple concrete examples to make it clear some of the different ways this can show up. So one example of algorithmic bias that has, again, really happened is predictive policing. If you're not familiar, predictive policing is a tool that a lot of police departments use, and it uses past data about where crimes have occurred to predict where crimes will occur in the future so that police departments can decide where to send the most resources, often in terms of staffing. The challenge with this is that crime is not rainfall. So it happens because someone is there to record it. That's how we get crime statistics. We can't set something up to just measure it in the absence. And we as a society define what crime is. So there are things now that are not crimes that in historic data will show up as a crime being committed. And the way this often plays out is that neighborhoods with more residents of color, neighborhoods with lower socioeconomic status that have been historically over-policed have more recorded crimes, and then more police officers are sent to those neighborhoods who record more crimes, and you get a very self-fulfilling prophecy. It also reflects that we tend to prioritize identifying and preventing certain types of crime. If our focus was on preventing white collar crime, we would be sending police officers to very different neighborhoods. A second example is facial recognition. There's been a number of news stories recently about failures of this technology. It's pretty well documented at this point that it tends to perform much more poorly on darker skinned faces, and particularly on darker skinned women's faces. And this is an issue of the data these tools are trained on, which tend to be mostly light skinned male faces, but also the hardware. Cameras have for many, many years, even before digital technology, been designed to perform the best taking photos of light-skinned people. So you have this intersection of the software and the hardware really disadvantaging certain groups of people. And then the technology is used in settings where the stakes are very high when it's used by law enforcement to identify someone on surveillance footage. Another example is child welfare case screening. So an increasing number of counties are adopting algorithms or AI tools that when someone calls into a child welfare hotline, help make the determination of whether that report should move on to screening or a full investigation of whether there is child maltreatment. And the issue is that often these tools are using data from public benefits systems to supplement the information obtained on the call. But not everyone is in those systems. So what happens is that the people who are reported because of concern for child maltreatment, if they are receiving healthcare through a public insurance program, that information is factored into their score, and things like their healthcare utilization become part of the risk score that's assigned to them. Someone could have this same healthcare utilization through private insurance, and it would not be factored in. So you have bias in terms of how data are obtained and what's assumed to be predictive. And then finally, the last case is allocation of in-home services for people with disabilities. And this is a case where a lot of the bias is coming from the way we think about these services. So we tend to, in the US, set up disability services with a focus on ensuring that no one who we think shouldn't get services does, rather than thinking about extending benefits to the most people who would be helped by them. And so as we adopt algorithmic tools to decide who should get benefits and how many hours of services, it's done in a way that's focused on excluding people who we think are getting too much rather than including people who are getting too little. So I'm going to talk a little about where these different examples of bias and others come from, because they're not just happening out of nowhere. So algorithmic bias can result from really explicit intentional choices about how algorithms or AI are developed and used, but often they're the product of de facto standards. And what I mean is no one is setting out and saying, let's make a tool and use it in a way that harms people. But we live in a society where there are a lot of pre-existing disparities in outcomes, in access to resources, and so forth. And that means that when we start using tools in that context, there's a real risk that we reinforce those underlying disparities. And as a result, AI is a technology that is very susceptible to replicating societal biases, often without the full awareness of developers or the people deciding to use it. The sources of bias within AI occur across its development life cycle. So you can kind of think of how people set out to create an algorithm or AI as having different stages. And some of these stages are problem definition, data access and use, algorithms specification, and then the use of that tool itself. So at the very beginning, if you want to create AI, you need to have a clear sense of what the problem this tool is solving is, and it needs to be defined in a way that a computer can understand or can operate on. Computers are not people. And so there's a lot of things you can say to a person, and a person will kind of fill in the gaps or know what questions to ask or be able to adjust. And a computer can't do that. And that means that often when we use AI, we need to define problems in ways that don't quite match what we would actually observe happening in the world. And there's a lot of room there for bias to creep in because computers need information to be numeric and they need it to be stored in a certain way. And a lot of social problems are hard to measure numerically and hard to communicate that way. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. The other issue is what problems we decide AI is good to solve in the first place. We're not making equal choices about every possible problem. There are certain types of problems that people are kind of looking to AI more, and that's another way that bias can creep in. The second step in this process is figuring out what data should be used to develop and train and test AI tools. And there's a lot of ways for bias to be incorporated here because of what gets measured in the first place. So if you've ever done work on secondary data, you're probably really familiar with all the times you have a problem you're interested in and you want to study it and you have a data set and that data set doesn't quite have the variable you would most like to be working with. And so you choose maybe the second best option. And just like in research and analysis, that can mean that your results are close to what you want, but you have to kind of think about the limitations. When we build algorithmic tools, we often are making do with data that aren't quite what we would want. They measure something that is almost what we're interested in, but that's also an area where bias can show up. And similarly, there's just limitations because of how and where we obtain data. Typically, the data sets for AI are not based on data that we explicitly collected to build this model. We're making use of data that are already out there. And so that means that sometimes we have data that were collected for one purpose and now we're using them for another. And of course, there's a lot of influence of systemic bias on historic data. So often we want a large data set, and in many cases, for a lot of more powerful types of AI, we need very large data sets, which often means using longitudinal data. But that longitudinal data often includes reflections of historic bias that then get carried forward. Another area where bias creeps in is algorithms specification. So thinking in terms of kind of how an algorithm is designed to operate. This can have to do with the way it treats outliers and edge cases. So outliers would be individuals who are very different from most other people in a data set. Edge cases would be people who are kind of on the extremes of the range of cases an algorithm can deal with. People are pretty good in decision making a lot of the time at adjusting to this and kind of going, okay, this person is different, but they're similar to this situation I've seen before, and I'm going to adjust my decision accordingly. Computers are very bad at this. This is not when they tend to work well. So that's a real risk with AI. And another big area is this question of transparency versus opacity. And what I mean by that is that some of the newer forms of AI, like machine learning, are so technically complex that no one can quite explain how they're moving from the input they're using to the outcomes they arrive at. We can get an approximation, but they're so computationally complex that people can't really understand and explain them. So that's sometimes described as being technically opaque. But another issue is that even a lot of simpler AI tools are proprietary and they're considered trade secrets. And so although people could understand them, they don't have access to them. So we have tools that are being used in decision making, but only a small group of people, if anyone, can actually say, here is how we arrived at this outcome. And then finally, there's a lot of ways that bias creeps in just through the way that we use AI. Some of this has to do with automation bias. Automation bias is something that's been documented in research for decades now, including in studies of how people use autopilot systems. And it basically is this phenomena where, for whatever reason, people are sometimes too willing to trust output from computational systems, even in situations where there's very clear evidence that that output is wrong. And this has been tested and documented for over 40 years now. It's very well established, and it's a big issue as we turn to more incorporation of AI in high stakes decision making. Another issue, as I just mentioned, high stakes use. There's a real difference between building AI into something like when Netflix recommends what movie you might want to watch next versus when a court makes a decision about whether or not someone should be released before trial. There are also a lot of issues of bias related to disclosure and ability to opt out. People often don't know when algorithms or AI are being used to make decisions. And even when they do know, there's often no clear way to opt out. And so then you see bias because of use of these tools in the public sector. If you rely on public benefits, you don't have the option necessarily to either know when an algorithm has been incorporated into that benefit system. And even if you do know, you may not be able to opt out. Whereas someone who doesn't need those benefits isn't subject to that algorithm, or someone who's on benefits but has a way to circumvent them can get out of that algorithmic use in a way that people who are more reliant on them can't. And then finally, there's a lot of issues with regulation and oversight, or really lack thereof. So right now, these tools are being adopted very rapidly, and there isn't a clear process of who regulates them, who makes sure they're safe, who certifies them. That is still very much an emerging discussion. So having made this all sound extremely dire, I want to close with some thoughts about ways that we collectively can think about addressing and hopefully preventing algorithmic bias as we continue to see adoption and development of AI. So once again, I've organized these around some of the different stages of AI development. And that's because algorithmic bias needs to be considered at every stage of AI development and use. This is not something that we can only think about after tools are in place. It has to be proactive. So when we define problems, we need to be clear about whose values and perspectives are elevated. We need to think about this is a problem according to whom. We need to think about whether AI can actually solve the root issues or if we are avoiding addressing bigger societal problems and just applying new technology because it's an easier way. When we think about the data that we use to develop and test models, we need standards for data set creation and documentation. We need to make sure that when a tool is created, we understand clearly the data that we're used to create it, and that other people can recreate that data set and recreate that tool. We need to think about making these data sets publicly available, and we need to subject them to external auditing so that we don't just take the word of developers, that they were careful about who was included. When we think about algorithms specification, we need to be thoughtful about designing tools that complement humans rather than replacing them. Humans are really good at some things. Humans are not great at other things. AI is really good at some things. AI is not great at other things. We need to think about how do we reorient our thinking about AI away from this idea that it's going to replace people, and instead think about how do we use this technology to free up humans to spend more time and energy on things that humans are uniquely equipped to do. Similarly, we need to think about interface design that supports an appropriate level of trust. So that means thinking about how do we, when we present the outputs of a system to humans, flag for them how much certainty surrounds a prediction, or how much trust they should put in it, or nudge them to, rather than just relying on it, to use that as part of broader critical thinking and decision making. And then there's also some ideas about human in the loop design, where systems only work when a human is explicitly involved in the process. And there's now newer proposals around society in the loop, where we explicitly design AI to incorporate societal values. And then finally, when we use these tools, we need to think about notification of use, having an opt-out and appeals process, and making sure that those processes are clear and accessible. So my last points before I wrap up and hand it off to Nir, beyond these kind of specific stage approaches, I want to propose a few overarching ways that we can mitigate bias in AI. One is to increase participatory approaches in AI development. And so this means making sure that members of impacted communities are involved as experts and co-creators when we develop these systems. And I want to really stress that this is not about inviting a few people and saying, look, we have these couple people and they got to help. Ideally, participatory work is about emancipation rather than empowerment. And what I mean by that is it's not giving people a little taste of power in a fundamentally disempowering situation. It's about moving beyond a situation where some people are consistently disempowered. The second kind of big picture proposal I have is to be really critical about our reliance on AI and algorithms. We need to think about standards and guidance for when their use is permissible and what the minimum safeguards are we have to have in place before we move to relying on them. We also need to be realistic about AI's power to solve what we sometimes call wicked problems. So there are a lot of thorny societal issues, and they've endured not because we just didn't have the one magic technology to solve them. They've endured because they're complicated, they're multifaceted, and they're hard to solve. And there probably is not just, as soon as we get the next technological advancement, we're going to solve them. That's not realistic. If that were the case, we would have solved more of them by now. And then finally, probably because I'm a policy researcher in a school of social policy, I think we need to be more insistent on regulation and independent oversight. And that includes building on existing frameworks. We have established licensing systems for other technology there is no reason we can't come up with a licensing system for emerging technology as well. Similarly, we have legal frameworks around things like equal protection or this state actor and doctrine to govern when we have public sector use of AI in decision making. And we can think about explicitly expanding these to incorporate the way we're seeing governments and public actors use AI tools. And finally, I would push all of you individually to think about how often we hear the narrative that the government is just not equipped to regulate AI. The government has a long history of regulating new technology pretty effectively. And we've allowed tech lobbyists to spin this narrative that we just can't do it this time. And I think policy people can learn a little from how much technical experts have been willing to speak on policy issues, and we can all maybe speak a little more on technical issues. So obviously, this is a lot to cram into 30 minutes. If you like this, I have a free online course if anyone wants more, and you're also welcome to email me. And I'm very excited to hear what Nir has to add to the conversation.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ian Moura. And we have many questions for you, but we're going to hold our questions for after we hear from Professor Eisikovits.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me if I speak from here? Or? Do you want to turn this? Yes. So thank you, Dr. Tefera and Dean Medicine, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. My daughter is a Brandeis graduate, so I'm always excited to come back here. In line with my techno-skeptical talk, I won't have slides, so bear with me. Ian raised for us beautifully and rigorously some of the most important equity concerns with artificial intelligence. Questions around algorithmic bias, which we've just heard about. Also questions around unequal access to the technology itself, even if it's not biased. Like all technologies, there's usually a socioeconomic disparity in who actually gets to use it. To look at a few other of the sort of famous problems that you've probably heard of, the famous problem of hallucinations. The technology, especially generative AI, tends to very confidently say wrong things. This is even true of the most advanced models like ChatGPT 4 and the one that follows that. Relatedly, the technology can be used to create deep fakes and loosen our grip on what's fact and not and what's not fact. AI allows very powerful manipulations of our personal data to provide pretty frightening predictions of what we might be interested in buying, what we might be services we might be interested in using. Those can be sold and used in ways that hurt our privacy. AI-driven technologies like self-driving cars, like in another context, autonomous weapon can actually kill people, whether advertently or inadvertently, and whatever advertent or inadvertent means in that context is a good question. So all of this is quite frightening. But I want to propose to you, this is a trick that we philosophers often play. I want to propose a thought experiment. And we like thought experiments, both because we can't be bothered to make real experiments and because they are actually quite useful for sort of sharpening where our intuitions are about some questions. So suppose with me, ex-hypothesis, suppose with me for a moment that these problems that Ian raised for us and that I suggested are actually solved. They are as Ian was saying at the end of his talk, many of them are solvable if the political will and the commercial incentives align for them. So for example, algorithmic bias is a solvable problem. Whether we're going to solve it or not is a different question, but it's a solvable problem based on improving the kind of data that comes in, on coming up with more equitable models to run manipulations on that data by putting in place some kind of quality control where both the data and the models are checked by people. And for an example, Microsoft was having very big problems, I think as Ian was hinting at, with bias in its facial recognition systems that generated quite a bit of public outcry and public outrage. And guess what? The models improved. The models improved pretty significantly. So companies can be shamed into improving them. Companies can be regulated into improving them. Some kind of combination of both can take place. So what I'm trying to say is you could imagine a world in which the technology is more and more fair, rational, and just, that these calls that it's making have improved. In fact, human judgment is famously biased too, as we know. In principle, for example, self-driving cars are probably going to be, they're not yet, but they're probably going to be 25 years from now, significantly better drivers than human drivers. That's a solvable problem. There's no reason not to think that mortgage allocation AI, even punishment recommendation algorithms couldn't do an actually better job than human beings can do with those, with the relevant kind of supervision, with the relevant kind of fixes to both the data and to the model. And so I guess my first question to you is, if you could imagine a world in which problems of algorithmic bias and hallucinations and deep fakes were solved. And again, this is a thought experiment, but it's not science fiction. There's no contradiction in imagining that. If you could imagine a world in which would that happen, would there be nothing left to worry about? Would we have reached the sunlit uplands and could we all sort of march confidently into the future? I'd like to suggest that there probably is something. There's quite a bit left to worry about. One thing to sort of, and the general neighborhood of all of those worries is, how does this technology, even if it's fairly deployed, change how we understand ourselves, change some of the qualities that we most value about ourselves? So there's the question of de-skilling. We're judgment-making creatures. What it means to make a judgment is to weigh certain particulars that are relevant to each situation and see what is more or less significant for it. Not to be so abstract. If somebody calls you, for example, and asks for a donation to the Firemen Beneficent Association on the phone, what would normally happen is you kind of think to yourself, is this a real organization that exists? How much money do I still have to spend this month? What kind of donations did I already make? What is the financial status of this organization? How much do I care about it? Who else has a claim on my concerns? And you make some kind of call. Now, this is exactly the kind of decision that AIs can make, right? And therefore, they actually have been involved in hiring and firing and mortgage approval decision, punishment recommendation, police force allocation, as Ian was saying, dangerousness determinations. In principle, these are decisions that AI could make. In principle, they're decisions that AI could make better than us, actually. It's not doing that yet. It's very far from it, but it could do that better than us. If it does do that better than us, these are all areas in which human beings used to make judgments. Now, by the way, middle management used to decide on mortgage allocation. It was not free from bias, incidentally. The bias was not born with AI. It was not free from bias in any way, shape, or form. But there are increasingly fewer and fewer areas where middle management make those kind of judgments because they're being farmed out to AIs. And one problem with them being farmed out to AIs, as Ian was saying, is that the AIs aren't doing an equitable job. Another problem, though, is that what if they were doing an equitable job, right? We're judgment-making creatures that are about to make many, many fewer judgments than we used to make. In mortgages, in police force allocations, in hiring and firing decisions. And the thing about judgment is it's like a muscle. You either use it or you lose it. If you make less judgments, you become less capable of making judgments thereafter. So the context in which we are going to make judgments is increasingly shrinking. Now, the usual response to that, and Ian even pointed us to one version of that, is, well, yeah, but we'll be freed up to make more strategic judgments, right? So it's kind of route judgments that are being farmed off to the AI, and it frees us up to make, higher level judgments. That's true to a degree. There's two problems with it. One is in any commercial activity, in any government activity, there's only so many strategic judgments that need to be made, right? Not everybody can be a strategist. And the logic of the technology is actually, it's a commercial logic. And the logic of the technology is not to free us up to make strategic judgment. It's, in the end, the telos of it ultimately is to replace labor. Otherwise, AI companies would not be racing to make new AIs that can make strategic judgments. So the holy grail, which probably, at least if you listen to Google's main AI scientist, is about 5 to 10 years away, is artificial general intelligence. This idea of an AI that is as good as humans across the board in decision-making, that would sort of probably, to again stay away from the realm of science fiction, would unify narrow AI tasks under some kind of general algorithm that would know how to coordinate with them. And you'd get, the mortgage decision-making with the TV recommendation, with the book recommendation, with the Spotify, with the driving, and so on and so on and so forth, right? That, again, is not science fiction. So, well, another retort about this de-skilling anxiety is that that's okay, even if it does ultimately replace much of the judgments we make at work. We can still make judgments in our leisure time. So there will be policy solutions to the fact that fewer and fewer of us will work, which is conservative estimates of that are about 25 to 30% of the workforce in about a generation would be not replaced, but displaced by AI. We'll figure out some kind of universal basic income or some kind of other policy solution to support the population that doesn't work. How they'll pay for all the AI products, I don't know, but that's a different question. And you'll make judgments about what to read and what wine to drink and where to hide, and these will be the judgments that you'll make. So everything's going to be fine. And I think it's what?
Everything's going to be fine.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument. I don't think everything's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine because, first of all, we're not great at making low stakes judgment as opposed to high stakes judgment. So when we kind of decide what music to, for example, in our current leisure, when we decide what music to listen to on Spotify or Apple Music, most of the time we just default to one of the suggestions that it has. We don't have the time or the energy or the wherewithal to actually think about it very, very carefully. Actually, quite often people listen to less the variety of music on the music services than they used to when they had a CD collection, weirdly enough. And second of all, we will already have been conditioned, because judgment making is like a muscle, to make fewer judgments by the time we get to the sunlit uplands of the life of leisure, that we will kind of have lost the capacity. So one kind of set of worries, to summarize this last point, is about what happens to us as judgment-making creatures. But AI, as it already exists, is also reshaping some of maybe the most valuable, most meaningful ways in which, or categories through which we think about ourselves. So think about generative AI, the broad category of stuff like ChatGPT and Midjourney, the stuff that you can prompt for an increasingly impressive result, whether in writing or in art or in music or in video. Generative AI is reshaping our understanding of creativity. It's moving us to almost fetishize having an idea instead of the process of realizing an idea that we had in the first place, right? So an example would be, write me a short story in the, I don't know, style of O. Henry, about a turtle that blah, 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 right? And then the AI gives you a draft, and you prompt it again, and it gives you another draft. And the same is true about making music, and the same is true about making visual art. And there's a sort of shift from the actual drawing or writing of a draft or slow composition of a song to being able to describe in an increasingly sophisticated way what you wanted to make. And the making itself is either consciously or unconsciously being defined as drudgery, as less interesting work. That's weird. It's weird because if you've written a paper as a scholar, as a student, as a high school student, and if you've taken it seriously, you know, for example, that your original idea for the paper was modified in the crucible of the actual writing of the paper, and often the original idea is completely unrecognizable by the end of it. And that is slowly disappearing. So there's at least a shift in what it means to be creative. And it's a shift we're making, as is so often the case with emerging technologies, without carefully thinking about it. So in other words, do I want this new world in which creativity has been stood on its head? Now, maybe the answer is yes. My question to you is how many explicit conversations we've had about that, and I think not many. By the way, in this context, the coming demise of writing as an activity, writing is going to become devalued, just like any activity that can be automated to generate a large amount of it without human intervention, in the end, historically becomes devalued. I've been speaking to many university executives, both in my university and in others, that are very interested in how you introduce new forms of assessment into higher education instead of writing, since ChatGPT can do writing. Writing is not as important in every single, I don't want to be dogmatic about it, in every single discipline that a university deals with, but it's really important in many of them. And it's still the best tool we have for critical thinking, for learning to make an argument, for learning to be skeptical about your own arguments, for learning to distance yourself from your own thoughts enough so that you can sort of rethink them. That's pretty quickly, without much thought, disappearing. Is there a cost to that? Is there not a cost to that? People who insist on it are seen as kind of, in their classes, are seen as sort of out of touch, as dinosaurs, as too naive to know what their students are really doing. So that's the questions around creativity and the introduction of generative AI is one set of questions. Again, the questions are about categories that matter a lot to us in understanding ourselves. Another category like that is the notion of serendipity, that in many of the stories we tell about our lives, things that happen to us by accident, from meeting our partner to finding a hobby, to finding a passion in life, happen kind of by accident. I took a wrong turn. I saw this new place became my favorite place. Or I went to, you can't go to Barnes and Noble anymore because they don't exist, but I went to the bookstore. I was looking for, a book on sociology. I went to the wrong floor. I found a book on gardening and miniature trees. I got into that, and that's how I got into it. Isn't that a funny story? The point of recommendation engines, which are completely ubiquitous, is to do away with serendipity, right? Here's what you're going to like on Netflix. Here's what you're going to want to read next. If you liked music by X, you're also going to like music by Y. And here's Waze or Google Maps that will tell you if you take this and that route, you'll save 7 minutes. Who can resist saving 7 minutes? And so accidental, not to talk about dating apps, right? Not to talk about some of those other contexts. Accidental discoveries are being pushed out of our lives because they are, sometimes for good reason, they're inefficient. But there are other values except efficiency that sort of fall by the wayside as this happens. So serendipity and creativity as two sort of basic categories, which have traditionally been important to people, are shrinking as a result of the introduction of this. I also want to point out a third concern. So one concern has been a concern with de-skilling, and specifically with the atrophying of our capacity for judgment. Another concern has been to the status of the basic categories through which we think about ourselves. A third concern has to do with some of our political institutions. Think about the idea of human rights, for example, the idea of international human rights. That idea philosophically is relatively old, probably from the beginning of the Enlightenment, if we're generous about it. Politically, it's sort of got a big boost in the aftermath of World War II and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations and so on and so forth. The grounding of that idea, the legitimacy of that idea, the argument culturally why that idea of human rights matters is this old notion, relatively old notion, derived from thinking of Immanuel Kant, if you want, that there's something special about human beings that is not true about desks and not true about most animals, or at least traditionally all animals. The idea that we're rational, the idea that we can give ourselves rational command, that if I push over the table, it falls, but if Ian tries to push me over, I can decide not to try to push him back over, right? We give ourselves rational command. This is the sort of classical Enlightenment notion of why we deserve status. And that rationality, it's the big substratum, the much more important substratum, according to the Enlightenment picture, much more important than our gender, our race, our religion, our place of origin. That's what we share, and that's the basis of the notion of human rights, this idea of rationality, right? If you remember the old MasterCard commercials of like, for some things, you can use MasterCard, but some things money can't buy, right? Those things that money can't buy are this sort of human uniqueness, right? Well, what happens in a world in which machines make better judgments, rational judgments, than human beings, right? What happens in a world in which an AI is better than us at, and more fair than us, and more equitable than us at making punishment recommendations, at making mortgage decisions, at making hiring and firing decisions. That raises questions about this uniqueness. What happens in a world in which machines regularly, and we're not there yet, but we're not far from it either, in which machines regularly pass the Turing test, namely, you can't tell if it's a human being or not, and you can tell because from the jokes to the tone of the voice to the level of knowledge, it just sounds like a human being. Now, by the way, large language models can already do that. They are calibrated to sound wooden, mainly for liability reasons. So in the first few months of them sort of hitting the market, they sounded a lot more crazily human than they sound now before OpenAI and Google, et cetera, and Meta got scared about what could happen because of some incidents. But my question is, well, what happens to sort of our traditional idea of human uniqueness and the institutional protections that go with human uniqueness when human beings are not unique or are functionally not as unique as they used to be? That could lead us, it's already led some to say, we're not that different from generative AIs. This is some linguists have called this a stochastic parrot model, right? The idea that AIs like us learn language by being immersed in context in which they make predictions for long enough so that they start making the right predictions. That language learning of an AI is not that of the new AIs, of the large language models, is not that advanced. That we kind of put on the internet everything that we have to give. We gave the machines access to that as their training data, and that's why they're sounding a lot like us. That's one direction this could go. The other direction this could go is to say, well, if they sound a lot like us, if some of the newer large language models actually have emergent qualities, namely they're capable of achievements that, while not cognitive, their programmers themselves don't know how to explain. If you have increasingly people reporting that they get more from their chatbot psychotherapy than they get from their actual psychotherapy, which you're welcome to look up, is an actual set of approaches that's coming. There slowly starts being an argument there of giving status to the machines too. Robot rights, machine rights, right? I mean, then why, like, does the fact that the AIs are made of silicon and that we are made of carbon, is that enough to just say, you know, human rights only for humans? So that is also a conversation that is starting to take place. Now, if you start thinking about robot rights, that's going to dilute expanse and purchase of rights in general. We are still doing pretty poorly with human rights, and yet we're starting to create an argument for robot rights. So that's insofar as the influence on basic institutions. So I was just asked by our chief technology officer to sort of at UMass to join him on a group coming up with an AI policy. And the premise was very much this. I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure you've heard versions of it here at Brandeis, and there's versions of it in high schools, both public and private, across the country. The premise was, this is already coming. There's nothing we can do about it. This is going to be part of the future. We are going to put our students at a disadvantage if they're not exposed to it. Therefore, we might as well teach them how to use it and figure out how to make good use of it. If you can't beat it, join it, sort of family of argument. Can't do anything about the arrival of this new tech, might as well learn how to use that. That's a nonsense argument. Like, you don't have to accept the premise of that argument at all. There's a point to it. You could make a plausible argument like that in national security and say, you know, if China is going to incorporate AI into its weapon systems, and we alone are going to insist on humans in the loop in certain kinds of engagement, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. I think there's real questions about that too. But there, at least, the stakes are such that the argument deserves serious considerations. But in higher education, why? Like, there's an argument for, at the very least, moving the burden of proof to these companies that should make a case. Why is this absolutely necessary for the education of a young person? Why is the loss of writing and the critical thinking abilities that come with that worth it in some kind of exchange? There is something a little techno-determinist, defeatist in the idea that, of course, we have to, now bow before, I forget his name because he annoys me. AI dude, Altman. Before Altman and the other gods of generative AI, and change everything we do within the scope of like 2 years. 2 years ago, we didn't hear about any of this. It still existed. Just because it's inevitable. And here's an interesting piece of evidence from very recent history about it not being inevitable. So pretty much, smartphones were introduced in 2007, pretty much after 2012, about 5 years into their introduction, we started hearing there's no point in fighting this. This is ubiquitous. This is going to be everywhere. Most parents sort of gave up on their teenagers having them and tried with the very, very meager tools that existed to limit their screen time. And here we are 17 years later, right? Or 18 years later, it's 2024, almost 2025. And across the country, schools are starting to, and in Europe, schools are starting to take smartphones out of school, because we realized that for 20 years, less than 20 years, we've been playing this gigantic experiment on our kids without knowing where it's going, without knowing what it's doing. And we're like, actually, never mind. This was a mistake. There's no commandment that says we have to make the same mistake with AI. There's limited use of it. The people who want us to use it and who are trying to sell it to us are sort of morally obligated to make the case for it, rather than us making the case back that it's not useful. So that has been broadly my Luddite case, and thank you for indulging me.
Thank you so much. Provocative and a lot to chew on, including, don't we need to know about it in order to know what we are for or against? So as a part of that, that's the dialogue, is for us to hear from so many different perspectives on this topic. And thank you, Dr. Ian Moura, for asking that question about will AI ever solve that wicked problem, and that there are wicked problems that it may not immediately be able to solve, like climate change, I imagine, would be an example of a wicked problem. And then Professor Eisikovits saying, well, someday it will, and then where will we be? So provocative, I want to open up for questions. Please say your name, your program. I'm going to go to the first hand here and second hand.
Okay, my name is Eben. I'm here at Hela doing the SID program. I have 2 questions. Should I just pick one, or I can ask? That's it. Pick one. Okay. Okay, I'll pick the first one. So, Dr. Ian, I think you spoke extensively about the bias that AI has, which was very interesting and eye-opening for me. My question is more of the response of the AI companies and even governments to these issues that have been raised about bias. What have they said, and what are certain steps that they have taken since these issues have been raised up to sort of address these issues that have come up? Thank you.
Thank you, Eben.
So the response from companies has been, and Nir, feel free to add on. I I would characterize it as largely minimal and under duress. So mostly companies have responded to these issues only when it's become financially untenable for them as corporations to ignore them. So there have been really pretty well documented reporting on bias for a solid 8 to 10 years now. And companies have had a lot of time to mount a really robust response, and by and large, they haven't. And often it's been, particularly in the public sector, because a lot of my focus is use in public sector of tools built by private companies. In many cases, it's taken lawsuits, and once people file suit, then sometimes the company does something. More often, the agency using the tool says, never mind, we're going back to human decision making, or never mind, we'll do something else. But in general, this has been like all of the response to bias has been led by either impacted communities, concerned scientists, and in particular, probably worth mentioning, a number of very high profile computer scientists at Google have been raising concerns about this for a long time, and many of them were fired. So Dr. Timnit Gebru, who's a leading expert on algorithmic bias and a computer scientist, co-authored a paper with other Google AI scientists that was very critical of Google's use of AI and approach to it. And after that paper was published, Google said, you need to disavow your findings. They refused, people were fired, and Google went on to dissolve their ethical AI team. And a number of other companies have also dissolved their AI ethics teams. So not the best corporate response.
Sure. So Ian's right. Some of the AI companies at least avow caring more about the harms more broadly beyond the bias. So there's a competing company to OpenAI called Anthropic, for example. They, at least in the declarative level, are much more interested about these questions. Some of the engineers working from them left OpenAI because of their concern for this question. That being said, all of them have been just racing to create more and more powerful foundation models, or more and more powerful large language models. So there's a weird sort of duality there. On the one hand, these are people who, to inflate their own importance in some way, say, this is as big as nuclear weapons, right? It's not really, I mean, but and at the same time, they say, and let's develop it as quickly as possible, right? So, you know, so just a small addition.
Writing department, earlier you mentioned how AI doesn't make decisions, people make decisions sometimes with AI. That reminds me of the gun rights argument. People don't, guns don't kill people, people kill people. You know, sometimes with guns, you could have that addendum. So I feel like the argument I feel like is maybe like taking away some of the maybe knowledge of inherent dangers in tools. You know, as true as the human autonomy and lack of object autonomy is, there could still be dangers of that tool. So I mean, it's kind of sort of, it's not a question, but if you have any sort of thoughts on tools.
Sure, I appreciate that point. I'd probably say it's a little different maybe from the discussion and debate around guns, in that, kind of to some of Nir's comments, there's been just widespread unquestioned acceptance of these tools, and often widespread, unquestioned acceptance of their capabilities. I sometimes halfway joke that AI is statistics with a better marketing team. Like it's not thinking, and it's not doing things any more than if you run a statistical model, that regression that you run is not making decisions and it's not doing things. And so I think your point is very valid that there can be some inherent risk in these tools, but I think it's a little different, at least from my perspective, than talking about guns, in that there is, in my view, too much willingness to accept autonomy from AI and algorithms. And so it's a different balance of argument when you're fighting against a lot of just assumptions that this tool that really is math is actually human-like, as opposed to the same kind of attempt to diffuse the role of the tool in creating harm.
To that, or, okay, and I think we may have, thank you for the question as well. We have one online and then we'll come back to the room.
Thank you, Maria. This is Raj. Should I unmute my video or?
Hey there, Raj. We hear you, we don't see you. There you are, we see you.
Great, great. Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Ian, for the great presentation, and Dr. Eisikovits for visiting our campus and the great work you're doing at the center at UMass Boston. You know, listening to the talks, I'm struck by an insight that doesn't really come up, which is there's pervasive human skepticism of AI. There's fear, there's fear-mongering, and, you know, I was struck by the last point in your presentation, Ian, about the participatory approach. But what struck me is that if you look at the history of systemic historical white supremacy, for example, given the legacy of colonization and slavery, there's from a critical race theory perspective, there's a history of white supremacy trying to negotiate the advancement of civil rights for everything else that's oppressed, every other group, you know, racial minorities, particularly the Black experience, Native American experience, disability rights, gender and sexuality, civil rights. That convergence interest between the powers that be and then the mechanisms by which we can advance the rights. And it got me thinking that, well, you know, here we are making the argument also about the inferiority of AI. So the antidote to both is, as you're saying, if we could just, first of all, uplift the voices of the most marginalized and socially excluded and the most intersectionally complex, but then the policy, equity, economic story as to how to give them the resources and, you know, give them a chance to actually produce their own technology platforms. But then how do we keep up with the rapid pace? You mentioned the Google outliers that called out the companies. How do we keep pace with the behemoths that have, you know, have monopolized the ability, talk about the able normativity within technology progress, already monopolized the ability for anyone else to try to challenge them and get them to market. So kind of this, what's the analogy between white supremacy, for example, that's as one major oppressive, you know, context. And then the criticism of AI is also inferior. How can AI in some respects be uplifted by BIPOC communities?
So I'll try, although I don't think I have much of an answer, to be honest. Look, the bigger economic picture is that the cutting edge of developing this technology, the incentive isn't really to uplift anyone. And I'm not sure, as long as the economics are the driving force, I'm not sure how that changes, except for specific cases of, you know, shaming companies or pressuring them after they've done something problematic. So it's a little bit analogous with the incentive structure in the pharmaceutical industry, and the argument that they keep coming back to is that without the basic capitalist incentive structure, they won't be developing the drugs. I think something along the same lines is used to kind of shield the biggest labs and the biggest companies from the kind of critique that you're making, if that makes sense.
Sure, I can add 2 points. One maybe a little more policy and one more theory. So first, I think Raj, your questions and comments point to why the work of people like Lena Khan with the FTC around addressing monopoly power within the tech sector is so important. And some of the work of scholars like Tim Wu, who really argued that the size of these companies and their dominance, both within the sector and within the economy overall, is an issue and that we need to start addressing it. But on the more theory side, I think we have a really unique opportunity as we're starting to think about what it means for a machine to be human-like, to reevaluate our assumptions about what people are fully human. And maybe we need to pause some of our debate about when is a machine thinking until we've worked harder to really recognize the humanness and human rights of all humans.
Thank you so much. We have one final question and then closing out the session. Can you say your name?
Hello, my name is Paul Roy. I'm a philosophy major, philosophy, economics, and education major. I guess I had a question about your creative, creativity comment. And I was sort of wondering, do you believe there's a world in which from like a Nietzsche, as like someone who's like a very Nietzschean thinker, do you think there's a world in which creativity and critical thinking isn't necessarily a value we need to have as humans, and we right now are biased in our attempt to think of it as something that is important because we're entrenched in it? Or do you think there's inherent value that humans in and of themselves to have when using critical thinking and creativity that can't be replicated by AIs?
Thank you so much.
The point in a way was simpler. The point was, yes, of course, there's great value in creativity. The point was that the companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic, that are creating the foundation models are pushing a pretty naive concept of creativity, a pretty naive version of creativity in which it's separate from and divorced from the process of the realization of whatever it is that you sort of initially conceive, and that process of articulation is becoming less important given the way that these technologies work. And the actual, if you will, phenomenology of creativity is a back and forth between having an idea and the work of executing that idea. At least that is how we conceived of it until now, and that's what's being destabilized.
Thank you so much to the audience. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And the next two conversations hosted by the Racial Justice Tech Policy Program focus on cybersecurity. One will be in Waltham, and one will actually be in Kigali, Rwanda, with the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. And particularly with a focus again on the exploitation of women and the issues of gender ethics in cybersecurity. So thank you to Dr. Tefera and our panelists and those who helped us, IT and Joanne Beswick, to organize today's event. And thank you for you all. It's a conversation where we share ideas and lift up the general knowledge around these topics, not to persuade you necessarily one way or the other, but to lift up the conversation and make it more accessible across the community. So thank you all for participating, and thank you to everybody online as well.